Hey, St. John. Welcome to Post Sermon Podcast. This is Deaconess Dahlia, and I am here with Vicar James today. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for inviting me.
You are very welcome. So we're here at episode 3, and I have to ask, is this the first podcast you've ever been on?
I'm pretty sure I've never been on a podcast before.
Very good. Well, I hope it's a good experience for you.
I hope so too.
So how long now have you been the vicar here at St. John?
Oh my, since July 1st, so that would be like 8 months now, just a little over 8 months.
Okay. And if there's one word you could use to describe your experience?
Oh, I don't know that I could use one word. It's been fun and challenging. It's been educational, right? It's been really good. I guess really good would be, that's 2 words, really good.
Excellent. Well, I do know people here will definitely miss you when your time to go back to the seminary is up. And one more thing before we get started on your sermon. The congregation knows a little bit about you already, military background. You were a drill sergeant, worked at the post office. What is something else about you that those sitting in the pews may not know?
Well, my father was in the Air Force, and so we moved around quite a bit when I was younger. So I was born in California. From there, we moved to Japan, and then we came back to California, and then we moved to Okinawa, and then from there, we moved to North Dakota, and then we went to England. I went to high school in England, RAF Lakenheath, and then from there, we went back to the States, where I actually graduated from California, and joined the Army from there. So I've traveled all over the place, and then of course while I was in those different locales, I went to different countries as well. So I've been pretty well traveled actually.
Wow, yeah, that's really cool. I wish I could ask you more questions about your travels, but instead we're going to just go into the sermon right now. So can you tell me a little bit about the text that you preached on this Sunday?
Yeah, sure. It's a really good text. It's Luke chapter 4, and it's the temptation of Christ. It starts out with Jesus coming away from the Jordan River and moving into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. One of the interesting things about this particular text, though, is right before it, Luke does something that all the other Gospels don't do, and that is he goes through the genealogy of Christ, starting with Jesus himself and moving through Joseph's line. He ends the genealogy by saying that he's the son of Adam, the son of God. And so right after Jesus is baptized in the previous set of verses, you get this genealogy that really wants to emphasize the identity of Christ. And so then this moves into the text that I was preaching on. And so, you get this really brief reference at the very beginning that Christ has left the Jordan. So he's just left the river where he was proclaimed to be the Son of God and that God was well pleased with him. And then he moves into the wilderness where the devil tempts him, and so he goes through all of these temptations, and at the end you get this moment of respite. It's really, really short, really brief, where the devil leaves him. And so the text is kind of nice because it goes through these 3 ideas of the Christian life that I was trying to hit on in the sermon: baptism, temptation, and respite.
Baptism, temptation, and respite. I thought it was really interesting in your sermon that when you started talking about baptism, you began moving to the font during it. Can you tell us why you decided to do that?
Yeah, I thought it would be a good image instead of just standing up in front of the congregation and trying to explain baptism, which they're all pretty familiar with, but rather to just move forward and try to present the image of baptism. It might make the image a little bit more concrete, a little bit more real to see it, to see the elements and where it's actually being physically done. So just to kind of get the congregation to remember their own baptisms and the baptisms that they've seen happen amongst themselves in this congregation.
So what was the problem that the sermon sought to identify?
In our lives, we often tend to just focus on the middle part of the life of the Christian, and that's temptation. We're oftentimes overwhelmed with temptation, and it comes from the inside and the outside. The world around us is constantly trying to tempt us, and then of course our flesh is also wanting to give in to these temptations, and this really becomes the not always, but a lot of times it's the central focus of our lives. We constantly are battling this temptation, and so that's the issue that the sermon was trying to focus on is this is the problem.
Sure. Then to move from the problem to then Christ, how was Jesus the medicine in the sermon?
Well, in two ways. One not quite as important as the other, but the first one is Jesus is an example. He's a model. He shows us the Christian life from baptism, temptation, and all the way to the promise of the resurrection. Right. So he shows that to us. But more importantly, because we're not really able to overcome temptation on our own, or at least not all the time, Jesus really overcomes that temptation for us. And so he points us to the promises of God that Christ has overcome all of this for us. He's overcome the world, sin, death, and the devil for us, and points us to the respite that is given to us in the resurrection. And so Jesus solves this problem, this focus on the temptation, by telling us that, pointing us back to our baptisms to remember that our identity in Christ, that we are children of God, and then also to point us forward to the resurrection, that the ultimate rest that we're going to have in Christ.
So then how did you intend to benefit your hearers in their faith with this?
Well, like I said before, really it was just to kind of outline the Christian life, right? It starts at baptism. It has this temptation part of it in the center, right? But it ultimately looks forward to the resurrection, to Christ. And so the idea was to outline this for the hearers, and so that they can see that even though that they're in this period of temptation, right, that there's rest available for them, right? And that rest often comes in the form of the gospel, the word, and the sacraments, and then also in prayer, but in a couple of other places that are often overlooked, and that would be the mutual conversation and consolation of the brotherhood. I mentioned that specifically. A lot of times in American society, we have this tendency to go it alone. We have to pull ourselves up by our bootstraps and not rely on others. But Christ gives us the church, right, to console one another, right, because we all go through these temptations, and we're here to support each other. And another way that we can another means that he gives to us is also confession and absolution, particularly private confession and absolution. I don't think we make very much use of this nowadays, but it's good to have this confessor to confess these temptations to, someone who can hold you accountable, while at the same time keeping the privilege, keeping that information privileged, so it's not out there. So I think those are some of the ways that Christ benefits, that gives the benefits of that we are receiving through Christ for this.
Sure. Yeah, you had mentioned brief moments of respite. So would you say those are examples of that rest we find? Mm-hmm. I also like that you brought up the private confession absolution. I don't think it's talked about in churches as much as maybe it had been. Maybe for people who aren't very familiar with it, could you expand on that and just tell us what exactly that is?
Sure. So the Lutheran Church has practiced private confession and absolution, throughout its history, but it has pretty much fallen out of favor because in favor of corporate absolution. But we do have a rite of confession and absolution. You simply go to the pastor, all right, and we have a short little rite that you can go through where you can confess your particular or individual sins or temptations to the pastor, and then he individually absolves you of them. And one of the benefits of doing this is that you can, well, one, you hear the absolution is for you. It's for you personally, right? And not just part of a corporate group. Not that that's any less valid, but it's good sometimes to hear that promise is for you. On Ash Wednesday, the pastors stood up there and gave each individual private confession, private absolution, and so that they heard the words that the forgiveness was for them. Another benefit for private absolution is confession and absolution is that you can be held accountable for it. And and if you're desiring to overcome those temptations and those sins, I think it's a good thing to have somebody there to confess that to, so that you're not just simply falling back into it over and over again.
That's well said. Yeah, I do remember Ash Wednesday. Many people found that really meaningful to have the private absolution said to them specifically. Yeah, thanks for explaining that. Going back, another question I have for you. What was a challenge for you with the sermon process?
Oh, I think there was two challenges. The first one was I used a structure called compare and contrast. So I was comparing Christ's life to our life. And so the way the structure folds out is you can either do it part to part or whole to whole. So I initially was going to do it whole to whole, and that is where you look at Christ's life in its entirety, from baptism, temptation to respite, and then compare ours to that. But that didn't seem like it was going to work out as well, because it was going to be hard to make the distinctions between the groups when you're telling the story and narrative. It's not as the distinctions aren't quite as prominent. So then I decided we'll just do part to part, look at Jesus' baptism, look at our baptism, our temptation and his temptation. The problem with that, though, was that I wanted to start with our baptism and then move to Jesus and then end with our respite, right? So I had to kind of flip that around. So I didn't use the structure quite as it was designed. So that was a little bit of just kind of working through that was a little bit of a challenge. And I think the second challenge that I ran into was saying the word respite, right? I really wanted to say respite. Respite? Yeah. Because that's how it's spelled. That, and I had the word despite in there a few times, and so it was just naturally to want to say respite, and so it took me a while to make sure I kept saying respite instead of respite. Respite. I like that. Well, good. That's all the questions I have for you. This is gonna wrap up the episode. Appreciate how do you think it went first time? I think it went okay. So we'll have to see what the reviews come out as. So you guys, just to remind you, there is a link to the sermon in the notes. You can also find it on the church website. Thanks again for joining us, and we'll see you later. Thanks for having me.